is Pride Month, and a new book out now charts the rise of the marriage equality movement. The Engagement, America's quarter-century struggle over same-sex marriage, is about the decades of activism that ultimately led to the Supreme Court's 2015 decision to legalize same-sex unions. The author is Sasha Issenberg, and Sasha joins us now. Thank you so much for joining us. So this is like the Bible of same-sex marriage, for sure. You really put a lot into it. And the first chapter starts in 1990. What's the significance of that year or the start of the new decade when it comes to the struggle for marriage equality?
Yeah, and Marie, before 1990, same-sex marriage wasn't really an issue in the United States. It wasn't a political issue in the way we think of it. There's barely a politician in the United States that had been asked his or her opinion on marriage. Gay rights activists were fighting on other fronts. Their opponents were trying to deny them other things, but were not trying to stop gays and lesbians from marrying. And there's a kind of wild PR stunt in Honolulu, Hawaii, that basically spirals out of control and ends up before the Hawaii Supreme Court a few years later. And that leads the country to have to deal with this as a political issue.
So before 1990, though, and before this wild PR stunt, clearly there were rumblings, there was conversation within the LGBTQ plus community, activists were talking. Can you tell us about sort of the pre-90s conversations and efforts to bring about same-sex unions?
Yeah, so there have been a handful of lawsuits after Stonewall in the early 1970s where plaintiffs went into federal or state court and sued for the right to marry. Very few of them had any sort of legal strategy. Gay rights organizations were not behind them, and those cases fizzled out pretty quickly. And the movement got distracted by other priorities. What was happening, to the extent that people were talking about marriage, there was a debate among gay lawyers and legal theorists about whether it was even desirable. And there was a very strong, sort of presence within the gay and lesbian community, mostly among feminist lesbians who were opposed to seeking marriage. They saw it as a heterosexist institution that, sort of was created to exclude women. And their view was, why should gays and lesbians aspire to be part of this institution that doesn't reflect their sexual values?
We talked a lot about that. I think it was last year. No, it wouldn't have been last year, perhaps the year before. We did a lot of coverage on Pride, and that was a surprise to me, but I totally understand why there would be sort of a segment that would say, we reject this idea of norms. The problem with complying with norms is that they've always kept us on the outside, so why are we fighting so hard to be on the inside of that? I totally get it. So this all leads to the momentous Supreme Court decision on June 26, 2015, making same-sex marriage legal across the country. But I'm wondering, are there still outstanding issues or threats looming on the horizon when it comes to this? Or is this victory an irreversible victory?
I think the core holding of it is irreversible. I don't think we're going to see what we saw with Roe v. Wade, where the opposition, almost 50 years later now, it still thinks that they can overturn the sort of central holding of the decision. What we are seeing are these religious liberty exemptions. There's a case before the Supreme Court right now in which private actors, we've seen this with bakers, we now see it with a Catholic social service organization, are trying to test the limits of how much they can basically opt out of recognizing same-sex couples that are married if they have a religious objection. And we could end up in a place where courts say gay couples have a right to marry, but lots of other people have rights to not recognize those marriages equal to opposite-sex marriages if they choose to.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if along this journey there was either a tipping point or a key moment or a key person that sort of put things over the edge. Like, as I was sort of thinking about this conversation with you coming up, I thought about how general morals or thinking about same-sex couples and about the LGBTQ community has evolved so much. So I grew up in a time as it was evolving. So I think I sort of evolved with it. My parents, it's a different time for them, and their friends. So for them, it wasn't really about this is a sin or this is bad, but they were not sure. They knew what they had learned as children, and they weren't sure about this new changing norms. But then suddenly it seemed like there was a tip where the majority of people didn't really think it was a big deal. So I'm wondering if you can identify kind of like that moment or that person or whatever it was that made the difference.
Yeah, I think that if you had to sort of pinpoint a moment, it would be May 17th, 2004, when Massachusetts starts the first legal same-sex marriages in the United States. And that obviously was not just a huge breakthrough for the couples that were involved and a sort of civil rights landmark, but it changed the sort of rhetorical foundation of this debate. Before that day, opponents of same-sex marriage were able to say, this will be the end of Western civilization in some cases. This will radically change the American family. We'll never be the same. There were these very apocalyptic warnings about what would follow same-sex marriages in Massachusetts. And even the biggest critic of same-sex marriage could not point to any major social change that followed it. You know, gay couples were not getting divorced at a higher rate than straight couples. There was no evidence that the children that they were raising were any worse off. You know, there were, you know, our schools continued, our jobs continued. And that made it really difficult, I think, in the years that followed for same-sex marriage opponents to keep their coalition together, because they were sort of, you know, all the strongest asset they had in these arguments was warning about what would be on the other side. And it turned out that what on the other side didn't really hurt anybody.
That's such a keen observation, Sasha. You know, I'm Canadian, and same-sex marriage was legalized in Canada much earlier. I think about a decade earlier. And but I was working in journalism at the time, and you know, when people would ask me about this sort of transition, I would always say, you know, what happened the day after same-sex marriages were legalized in Canada? Absolutely nothing. Right. People went to work, kids went to school, people prayed in church, a handful of people got married, just like they would have, you know, any other day. Yeah, it's a wee bit anticlimactic, but a very, very, very important shift. Sasha Issenberg, thank you so much. Thank you for writing the Bible on same-sex marriage, and I wish you luck with the book.
Thanks. Good to see you, Anne-Marie.
The Engagement, America's quarter-century struggle over same-sex marriage, is available right now.